Okay, in this tutorial, we're going to look at the exam question, which focuses on the consequences of certain population structures. In this case, we're going to look at the consequences of a population structure associated with a developing country, which in the exam question you can see on your screen refers to Malawi. Now, what I'd strongly recommend you do is see if you can list down the possible consequences of a country with a population structure that starts off like this in 2010, but changes to this in 2050. So when you look at the two graphs, we can see the number of young people all the way through to the 80 plus in the past, and projected into the future, we can see what changes are. Now, you're not being asked to describe or give reasons for these changes. That is not the purpose of the question. The purpose of the question is to identify what are the possible consequences of this. So before I go ahead and talk about the possible consequences, you might look to write down anywhere between 6 to 8 possible points that you could use to respond to this question. Okay, hopefully you've now established in your mind what the possible consequence could be for a country like Malawi. Let's have a little look at the change. Now, we're not really describing 2010. What we're really interested in is what is it going to look like in the future. So let's have a look at the future. This is Malawi in the future. Now, what you can see is that in every age category, there are more people. A good part of your answer is going to focus in the youngest age groups because we've seen a significant increase from around about 2.4 million to somewhere in the region of 3.5 million. So we've got a million more young people. Now, we don't need to say that to the examiner. They're not expecting to see us do that. They're expecting us to discuss consequences. Consequences can be both positive and negative, but we're going to primarily probably look at a range of negative consequences with a few positive consequences considered. Right, one big issue when you have large numbers of young people is that you are going to have to attempt to provide education services for this expanding youthful population. That goes from nursery to primary and eventually to secondary schooling. That is going to require resourcing and training of teachers, which is going to put a financial pressure on the system. Do you have enough teachers to cope with this number of people? And if not, then children are going to either miss out on education or are going to be schooled in very overcrowded classrooms, which will have an effect on their learning. The second issue is you're going to have to look to try to build enough schools for this expanding population. And if not, once again, you're going to have overcrowded classrooms and unfit conditions for which young people are going to be learning, which is going to increasingly also impact on their education. Another consequence of this rapidly growing population, and especially in the 0 all the way up to 15 to 19 age groups, is there's a considerable increase in the number of people you're looking to feed in your population. That's going to put a pressure on agricultural systems in the country, which may not be able to produce enough food, and therefore many children especially are going to go poorly nourished. A second consequence of that is, in an effort to try to feed a population, a country like Malawi is going to potentially get itself into debt as it borrows money in order to buy more food imports from abroad because its farming system is not able to provide enough food for its expanding population. Another issue is this expanding number of young people. And if we go further into the 20 to 29 age groups, where we also see a considerable increase compared to the past, is a pressure on housing. So existing housing is going to become overcrowded with more people. There's going to be increased demand on housing. Consequence of that will be that house prices will rise. But more than likely, there won't be a supply of enough housing, which will lead to slums forming, with people living in shanty towns. The impact of this, and you can take this answer a little bit further, where you can then consider the issue of growing shanty towns with a much easier spread of disease, and that these areas often are associated with high levels of crime. So that's another issue that you can bring into a well-established answer. Another issue, especially in the age groups over the age of 15, is an issue of employment. This much increased working population is going to demand work, and that's going to put pressure on the economy to create enough jobs for this expanding population. In reality, those jobs might not be created fast enough to keep these people in work, and the consequence of that will be high levels of underemployment. That's where people are not working as much as they could, or unemployment, and therefore people will live in poverty. Now you can develop this point into a further consequence where you then talk about increased levels of people living in poverty or underemployed could lead to increases in crime, especially in urban areas, which will be a big social issue. We're not quite finished though, because if we actually compare the top of the pyramid in Malawi in 2010 to Malawi in 2050, we see a lot more in the old age categories now. Now, the consequences of this is that the government is going to have to start thinking about providing a welfare system, some kind of care system for these elderly who are going to find it difficult to work in their older years. Now, as Malawi is poor, that's going to become increasingly difficult to provide things like pensions and care homes. So these elderly are more likely going to go uncared and therefore likely to be unhealthy, and their final few years of life will not necessarily be the experience that they have been looking for. We can extend this idea, though, and start thinking about pressure on health services because the elderly are more likely to use health services. So this old age group is either going to be clogging up the healthcare system in Malawi, or in all likelihood, the healthcare system won't be able to provide the types of services they require, and therefore they'll go untreated for illnesses that they might develop. One final point you can make about this increase in elderly is that because the welfare system and care system is unlikely to develop fast enough for this growing amount of people in the older population, is that it's going to be down to families and their networks and communities to care for this aging population. Now, that seems like a reasonable expectation, but the downside of that is very often people in these communities, and this might be often women or younger daughters, are given the responsibility of caring for the elderly, which either restricts their ability to work, or it might, if it's a younger family member, actually restrict their time at school, impacting on their education. Now, I've covered a lot of ground in this, and you might want to replay this and note some of these ideas out. And you'll notice how a number of ideas are connected to additional ideas. So there's an opportunity in a well-written answer for this question to develop points into additional points. If you're going to do that, you should be very clear by saying one consequence is, and then if you're going to develop into another point, you could then say, and a consequence of this thing is, and then go on to explain that additional point. Now, I did say it's not all necessarily negative. There are benefits of expanding populations. One of the positive consequences is that rapidly expanding populations have a large labour force. And this can be very attractive to international companies who might choose to set up in these countries to access this relatively large, and because it's Malawi, relatively cheap labour force, which might then go on to see lots of jobs created in the future in countries like Malawi. So that just shows you how you can bring in a positive consequence. Okay, go ahead and write an answer to that based on what I've said and use those notes to develop your answer.